Mark, I will say it's a real pleasure to have you here in Houston. And we will turn to your incredible book and really this most fascinating person, maybe in some ways of the last 10, 20 years for not just Hong Kong, but for all of China, to Jimmy's life. But maybe just to kind of open it up and give a bit of context to it, if Jimmy was here, how would he explain to an American audience or a global audience of why what happens in Hong Kong really matters? And really, should we be concerned that Hong Kong's the canary in the coal mine, that as rights fall, as repression happens in Hong Kong, is that what's happening in Taiwan 10, 20 years later? If President Xi might still be in power in 15 years, will he kind of look to secondary governments in Thailand that have, have ethnic Chinese populations? We're going to start there. Why does Hong Kong matter? How would Jimmy explain it, and how would you explain it? You lived there for almost 30 years. You've known Jimmy very well since the early 90s. Why should people care?
That's a great place to start, but let me start by, first of all, thanking you, Ronan, for inviting me down here. Although I have to say, when I think we were first in touch around November, I thought the idea of leaving New York and coming down here in February would be nice. I considered not bringing my overcoat, but I'm glad that I did. And Marty and the whole team at Asia Society, everybody at World Affairs Councils, thank you all. Funnily enough, the only other time I've been in Houston in my life was, in fact, with Jimmy Lai. We were on a cross-country bus trip, and we started in New York, went across through Pittsburgh, Chicago, down through Dallas and Houston, and actually ended up in New Orleans. I can tell you, Jimmy, we weren't here very long because we'd had some mechanical problems with our bus, and it delayed us in Dallas. But we had one of the best Cantonese meals of my life, and I know that Jimmy and the mostly Cantonese people on the bus were extremely impressed with the Cantonese food in Houston. So I'm sure Jimmy would love to make a return visit, and I think it'd be great to hear him answer that question when he gets out of prison. So Jimmy has been in prison now for a little over 4 years. That's over 1,500 days, mostly in solitary confinement, for a 77-year-old who had diabetes going in and has subsequently suffered from COVID and had a not very successful cataract operation. So he is, I think, really literally putting his life on the line for as a way of demonstrating the importance of Hong Kong. And I think what he would say, and I think many of us who love Hong Kong would say, is that the destruction, the needless destruction of Hong Kong, one of the freest, most open places in the world as recently as 6 years ago, and the impunity with which the People's Republic of China has broken international treaty obligations shows, in fact, the model of how the world that China wants. So when China talks about a rules-based international order, it means rules that we like, we think are great, rules that we don't like, we completely trash. And I think the speed, the ferocity, the depth of the crackdown is unparalleled, at least from anything I know of in the last 100 years, short of a war or a revolution. A perfectly fine city was destroyed as far as civil liberties go. Newspapers shut down, NGOs shut down. A city of what was 7.5 million people, although hundreds of thousands have left, is a place that has seen 1,900, more than 1,900 political prisoners. People have been convicted and jailed for political offenses in the last 5 years, not to mention a couple of thousand who have been held on bail without their charges actually being really even without being tried, and probably about 7,000 other people who have arrests hanging over them and are out on bail. So think of that, over 10,000 people who have been caught up in this political violence. I'd say this terror campaign in the last 5 years shows us really what China's vision for the world is. Tremble and obey. China promised that the people of Hong Kong would have universal suffrage, that there'd be a path to democracy, that Hong Kong people would be freer, far freer under Chinese rule. than they were during the 156 years of British colonial rule. And I think that's because China thought that it could cajole or bend the people of Hong Kong into voting for its candidates. So when the people of Hong Kong decided they had their own views about freedom and democracy, China proved utterly incapable of adapting and knew how to react only with a fist. And I think that's really sad, because it shows a lack of suppleness in Chinese policy making that I think, perhaps we should have been more aware of after the events, the Tiananmen killings in 1989. But I think we thought China had moved beyond that, and it's, sadly it hasn't. And we can get into what this might mean for Taiwan, but also for other countries in the region, the Philippines, others who don't like or who aren't kind of just submitting to the Chinese red lines. Or we could talk about in the UK, where I was just for the last couple of weeks, where I've got, I have colleagues and other people, activists in the diaspora community, who are being harassed and subject to legal and extra-legal, I guess, violence in many cases. And I think that shows, really, unfortunately, China's vision for the world. And Hong Kong, to use your phrase, it really has been the canary in the coal mine, because this is where we've seen how China interacts with an open, democratic, free society when it has the power to act with impunity.
And I think it's kind of a nice reference point for a Houston audience. Metro Houston, we're about 6.5, getting closer to 7 million. Hong Kong is about 7.5 million. So if you imagine 1,900 people arrested and evicted, and almost 1,000 people in Houston, arrested and being held just as political prisoners, most of them just for protesting or something they wrote online. It's kind of staggering. And maybe at the end we'll talk about it more, but you might have read in the BBC a few days ago, your colleague, young colleague, I mean very young, I think she was 19 when she was first perhaps charged in absentia, has basically had a bounty put on her head that basically it is $1 million in terms in conversions to about 50,000 American dollars for information leading to her arrest. And she's 19 years old, and sad kind of irony is that best picture, the only picture you can find of her is when she was 11. Just to put it in context, like how this extends, can you talk about Chloe Chung?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Ronan. I mean, it's a really troubling case. Chloe turned 20 on February 5th, actually when we were in London, and she was about to go on holiday on Christmas Eve, as was I, when she was awoken with the news that Hong Kong authorities had put this $130,000 bounty on her head. The chief executive, she's one of 19 people that has had these put on in the last year and a half in 3 tranches. The chief executive of Hong Kong, the mayor really, has said that Chloe and people like her are street rats who will be hunted to the end of the earth, and they can never feel safe again in their lives. In Chloe's case, she moved to the UK when she was 15 years old. She was not a student activist in Hong Kong. I think she went to a couple of rallies. She came to us and asked if she could do a gap year, kind of an internship, but a 1-year program. She said, I've just got to finish my A-levels. I'd love to come and work for you for a year. She ended up staying on. It's going to probably end up staying a couple of years, I guess. But she was cited, the Hong Kong authorities cited her solely for her work in the United Kingdom with the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. They accused her of being a secessionist, which I don't really even know what that means. It acts like she's advocating the independence of Hong Kong or the breaking away of Taiwan, which is nothing that our group advocates. What they really didn't seem to like was that she was calling for sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials. Now, you can think whatever you think about specific policies, these are perfectly normal free speech protected activities in the United Kingdom. She had done them, seeking, I guess she's on her way to getting UK citizenship. In the UK free speech protected activities, and yet the Hong Kong authorities feel they can act with impunity to put an international warrant out for her arrest. So Chloe doesn't know if she, for example, transits through Bangkok and she's just changing planes. Is there an Interpol red notice that would cause the Thai authorities to pull her out and send her back to Hong Kong for imprisonment? Simply, again, for doing free speech protected activities in the United Kingdom. I have another colleague, Frances Hoy, who has asylum in the U.S., has been here, for more than 5 years, went to university here. She also has a bounty out on her. Again, it's not clear, but these seem to be related both to what she's doing in the U.S. And perhaps what she did in Hong Kong. Never any evidence, but a clear attempt to chill and intimidate anybody who's a dissident. Now, I think in the case of Chloe and Francis, they're fine. But what about the families of people? And this is one of the most insidious and chilling new tactics of Hong Kong authorities. They'll pick up people's brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and they'll be brought in to assist with police investigations. Sometimes they have difficulty traveling. Sometimes they might have difficulty with work. I know someone whose sibling was threatened that his firm wouldn't get any more work in Hong Kong. He just took a professional services firm if the brother kept on with his activities. So I think we have to realize that there is something the Chinese are trying to map using Hong Kong, a kind of global repression of free speech. If you're saying things about the Uyghurs, about Tibet, about Taiwan, about Hong Kong, about basically anything the Chinese don't like, they think that they have the right to go after anyone, anywhere. And in that sense, again, Hong Kong is proving an unfortunate precursor to what the Chinese strategy is.
I was mentioning to someone outside, your book is incredible, and what's amazing is the real true story life, Jimmy Lai. Some of it's hard to believe. Like if Hollywood wrote something, say, oh, that's kind of crazy, it's kind of fun, but that could never happen. This could be split in 3 different parts. That would be 3 incredible tales that are hard to believe one person pulled this off and did this, rags to riches. We want to get mostly to focus upon where we are the last 5, 10 years or so. But just, if you can, relatively quickly, and again, it's in the book for anyone who wants to read the incredible real story, how is it that basically the same CCP that in many ways destroys Jimmy's life as a child and his mother's life and his possibilities then and his father's, and will later come back to haunt him. Can you briefly, I know it sounds hard, tell his incredible story of starvation and struggle getting to Hong Kong, and incredibly in his early 20s owning a factory when he was from nothing to the incredible story from there. And we'll pick up the end of the 1980s for an obvious reason.
It is, again, Ronan, you're right. If it were this kind of Horatio Alger story that I tried to write for a Hollywood film script, it would just be laughed out as just being kind of too improbable. But Jimmy was born, he was a twin. He was born 2 years before the Chinese Revolution. He was born in 1947. We think, even Jimmy doesn't actually seem to know exactly when he was born because there were no records. It was the chaos of a civil war followed by, the crushing political correctness of the early communist years. His father fled to Hong Kong. His mother stayed, but was sent to what Jimmy always calls a labor camp, but in technical terms, it isn't what we would call a labor camp. It was kind of in the neighborhood. He was born in southern China, on the outskirts of Guangzhou, what we used to call Canton, not far from Hong Kong. And she would come home on weekends, but meanwhile, her kids, the twins and an older sister, were like 4 years old, 6 years old. Pretty soon, Jimmy was repeating grades in primary school because he wasn't really going to school, hustling on the streets, picking up scraps of tobacco and rolling them into cigarettes and selling them, stealing scrap metal, selling it, stealing food because he was hungry. He's basically a juvenile delinquent. But kind of, I guess, a lovable rogue. There's a story, it's not in the book actually, the police come in, I don't think it is, come and bang on the door, and Jimmy opens it and sees them and shuts the door, and he says, "I didn't do it." And they said, "Actually, we just wanted to buy you dinner." They felt sorry for this little like ragamuffin kid. He was a porter at the railway station, and a guy from Hong Kong one day gave him a tip and a half-eaten bar of chocolate, and this was kind of this transformative moment, and he asked the guy, "Where are you from?" Hong Kong. Well, actually, what is this? Chocolate. Where are you from? Hong Kong. Sounds like paradise. I'm going there. He managed to legally, kind of more or less legally, get a one-way permit to go to Macau on the Portuguese colony on the western side of the Pearl River Delta, smuggled himself into Hong Kong, or was smuggled in on a people smuggling boat, landed at the age of 12 and a half in 1961 as an illegal immigrant. His mother gave him permission to go, and you think about it, I mean, you know, many of you are parents. Can you imagine your 12-year-old kid going, you know, I want to emigrate to, I don't know, anyway, somewhere else. So his mother agreed because this was a time of a famine that killed something on the order of 45 million people. I mean, think about that, 45 million people as a result of a politically induced famine, that spectacularly misnamed Great Leap Forward. So he rocks up in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is teeming with refugees. 1 million or 1.5 million refugees had already come in the previous decade, doubling the colony's population. People are living in shacks. His aunt and uncle, his mother had a sister there, are in such a small place, there's not even room for Jimmy to sleep on the floor that first night. So his aunt takes him to a glove factory, sleeps on a table, gets a job as works as an odd job guy, and 15 years later, this is Hong Kong, this is a story of freedom, hustle, just, you know, businesses going crazy in the kind of export boom, the early years of the Asian economic miracle, which was really not just a miracle, it was built on the sweat and toil of people like Jimmy. 15 years later, he buys a sweater factory. 5 years later, it's the largest sweater factory in Hong Kong. He's a serial entrepreneur, so he gets a little bored with making sweaters, decides he'll sell sweaters and shirts, starts this amazing retail company, Giordano, that becomes a trendsetter, a pace setter throughout Asia. And he's thinking, okay, what's the next business? Because he's about to list Giordano on the stock exchange. He says, you know, Chinese fast food, I'm going to do Chinese fast food. Kind of like I did fast fashion, I'll do fast food. And then the events of the spring of 1989 intervened.
Just to take it to Tiananmen, I think sometimes people might not remember those protests were happening all across China. Every small and medium-sized city, obviously just on a much larger scale in Beijing. There was huge solidarity by the Hong Kongers, the people in Hong Kong, saw what was happening, were supportive of what was happening. And then all of them, and maybe you can talk about, for Jimmy in particular, the utter shock and horror at how it concluded, the hundreds and potentially thousands that were killed. We probably may never know, at least as long as, there's this regime is in power. How did that really shape him and kind of shake up his ideas of business and what's important in life?
Yeah, I mean, so this was one of the pivotal moments in Jimmy's life. He had left China, so it had been almost 30 years by then. He'd kind of turned his back on the country. He'd thrown himself into Hong Kong. He became a man of the world. He was in New York quite often, Tokyo. Is this Garmento, this guy in the rag trade who made it really big. He's driving around in a Rolls Royce. He had a pet bear in the backyard along with a whole menagerie of other animals. I mean, he really was the crazy rich Asian. People were smoking weed and, half naked people in and out of his jacuzzi, I mean, it's like kind of pretty crazy scene. But he was really smitten by Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, which started in the early 80s, but were pretty nascent, pretty embryonic throughout that decade. But still, he was one of the people who knew him from the early 70s, described him as almost like a Zionist in his zealotry for for what was going to happen in China. I mean, this is so ironic that he's on trial on national security law charges because he's so Chinese. He loves China so much. Such a patriotic guy. He does not like the Chinese Communist Party, but he thought that Deng and the economic reforms would eventually lead to greater social and political liberalization. And he ran Giordano, this fantastic retail store that had branches throughout Asia. It was so successful that a guy named Tadashi Yanai had come down from Japan in the early 1980s to learn from Jimmy. He was starting a company to come out of his father's. His father had a little clothing store, and anyway, Tadashi and I ended up running, or the company he founded was Uniqlo, which of course is the dominant force in global fashion now. And he learned the concepts he learned were from Jimmy. We could go on and on about his entrepreneurial abilities, which just blew me away, even though I'd known him for 30 years. I didn't know a lot of the background pre-'89. But he decides he's really in solidarity with the students, as Ronan said, and he's going to make T-shirts with their faces. And 3 students in particular he featured, sold them at his Giordano stores, sent money up to Beijing that he'd made by selling the T-shirts, sent up tents and other materials. I mean, he was all in with material and money, and he's a very, very passionate guy, and he just thought democracy was it. And then, of course, the killings came. About a month or so after that, an editor at the South China Morning Post sent a young cadet reporter to go interview Jimmy. They're like, why don't you see this guy? He was so outspoken in favor of democracy before June 4th. What's he thinking now? And so one of the first interviews was written by, after Tiananmen, where Jimmy talks about media, was written by a young woman named Teresa Lee. And there are 2 ways I can go with this story. The quick one, I guess, is that Teresa leaves, and Jimmy tells his secretary Samantha, basically, I'm in love with this woman. His first wife had left him a few years earlier for another man, and I think honestly he was really at loose ends. He had kids who were early teenagers. The Tiananmen killings had just happened. He's kind of bored with his business, and he meets this remarkable woman who's more than 10 years his junior, but I mean has just a preternatural, I think, poise and confidence to her. He follows her back to Paris, where she's studying, woos her for several years. They marry. She is a rock, and you can't emphasize enough the importance of Teresa in, first of all, guiding Jimmy to convert to Catholicism a week after the handover, but also, and his Catholic faith is extremely important in helping him survive, but in being in court every day. He's been in court in this trial alone more than 130 days. She's there every day. She's visiting him every weekend. She gets to see him for 30 minutes 3 or 4 times a month. So that's the Teresa angle. The other angle is what he tells her is what he's going to do for his business, and that's like, forget about Chinese fast food, I'm going into media, because media, there's a new transparency. Technology with media is going to make it impossible for the Chinese Communist Party to hide behind this secrecy and opacity. He'd seen what CNN could do. We kind of forget that this was one of the first kind of almost live, almost real-time upheavals the world had ever seen. And remember, this is still July '89. The Berlin Wall has yet to fall. In fact, nobody could ever imagine the Berlin Wall falling in their lifetime. And so the Berlin Wall falls, and Jimmy was already well on his way to setting up this media empire. He thought that, again, that transparency and accountability brought by the media was going to bring about the kind of political and social and economic reform that China needed.
Yeah, I mean, an incredible story. First, really kind of got known around the world as really the original father of fast fashion, reducing production times from many, many months, sometimes to weeks, to even days, to be shipped off all around the world wherever it was needed. But you mentioned he transitions to a totally new endeavor to take on media, which probably is how most people in Hong Kong really know him the best over the last 30 years, from his daily and his weekly magazines. But can you talk about maybe how, and it's probably hard to pick an exact time and date, you quote him many times, and it's not just Jimmy Lai, it's most people, with a degree of optimism. Almost every American president since Nixon, I would say, Democratic or Republican, maybe until Obama and definitely say until Trump, had at least a loose hope that economic opening, economic prosperity, and supporting the finances and trade capabilities of China would eventually lead to at least a softening of the Communist Party, if not a full opening of the Communist Party. Can you talk about Jimmy's kind of gradual transgression himself? Because he felt himself that it could help moderate and reform and open up China, and maybe when and how he got to the point realized this is not going to happen. This is only getting worse, and they just have more money to have more power.
I mean, it's such an interesting question. First of all, he's incredibly optimistic, and yet at the same time, he's very realistic. I should, emphasize he could have left at any time during these 30 years. He's got I understand, a beautiful house in Kyoto, a house in Taipei, nice apartments in London's Mayfair and in Paris near the Eiffel Tower. This was a guy who had the means. He could have just gotten on a plane any day and left. And yet, as far back as June 1997, just before the handover, I saw him break down on stage at a panel like this with Al Newhart, the founder of USA Today, and he said, "I think I'm going to jail." And so he had kind of could hold two diametrically opposed ideas in his head at the same time. He knew it was going to be tough, but he towards the end would often say, "I don't know if we can prevail, but if we don't try, we're certainly not going to succeed." So he was always, he had this self-confidence and this drive, and he's a brilliant, compelling, charismatic person. And yet he was never in it for himself. He was not going to be a Nelson Mandela or a Lech Walesa. I mean, was not interested in political power. And so he just felt like he just needed to keep pounding away. And so another key turning point was in 1994, when the premier of China, Li Peng, who had taken power at a kind of coup d'etat that led to or helped make possible the June 4th events, visited Germany. It was the first time that it was part of a trip that saw him visit Western democracies first trip by a Chinese state leader since the Tiananmen killings. And Jimmy was so mad that he was in Paris. Teresa was pregnant with their first child, Sebastian, who was born October that year, 1994. And he wrote this angry note. And there was a column. He did a weekly column. So he did 1,500 columns or so for Next Magazine, the magazine that he started. And he faxed it off to Hong Kong. I talked to one of the editors on the other end, and they were like, they saw this, and they were like, what the heck? I mean, we write about Hong Kong. What's the boss doing writing about China? But whatever, Hong Kong's free. We'll write what we like. Well, the Chinese authorities noticed, and they started closing Giordano stores in the mainland, specifically one in Beijing. And Jimmy said, so what? And so he resigned from the Giordano board, then he sold all his shares in Giordano. He said, I can't do both. Now I can't think of another businessman who has stood up to the Chinese Communist Party since 1949, who said, forget about my cash cow, I'm going to take this kind of embryonic media business and go all in on that. So he then took a lot of the profits from the sale and started a newspaper. So the magazine, 1990, the newspaper, 95. And he just kept hammering away. So on the one hand, he could break down in tears. I mean, he's very passionate. He's very prone, actually, to crying publicly. And on the other hand, he's just so tough. And he has this self-confidence because he came from nothing, I think. And he was forged in these fires, as a kid, being a black market hustler at the age of 6 or 8, getting to Hong Kong, working his way to the top of, first the textile business, then the retail business. He just believes that he can do anything. So I think, obviously, towards the end, he realized he'd been way too optimistic. I mean, in 2000, he moved to Taiwan, and he was convinced that Taiwan was going to be a springboard to the mainland, and he was going to be able to take his Apple Daily newspaper, his Next magazine, and sell them in China. Taiwan's Mandarin-speaking, Hong Kong's Cantonese-speaking, so he thought that this Mandarin-speaking base would be particularly powerful. So he spent a lot of the first decade of the 2000s really putting his hopes into China. I think, like many of us, after Xi Jinping took power and it was clear that China was going the wrong way when it came to freedom, on the one hand, he became bolder and more personally, politically engaged, and yet on the other hand, I think a new sense of realism and a new sense of like, yeah, I really am going to jail set in these since 2014 in the umbrella movement.
And just, you mentioned kind of bringing up to 2014, and it's really these last 10 years that have been extremely intense, the most kind of shocking to Hong Kongers, the most repressive, the most restrictive. I know there's no easy way to know, and you're someone who was living in Hong Kong for many years before the handover in 1997. But do you think, say, perhaps when the UK and Thatcher and the CCP and Deng Xiaoping were negotiating the handover in the 1980s, the fact that China was not far from being a major, massive global power basically allowed for the idea or the agreement to go through will give Hong Kong 50 years of basically almost the same rights and freedom just to get the territory back. Do you think that disparity of power back then between where we are now is why things have changed? Or no matter what, the CCP would have done everything they could to eliminate the rights and freedoms of people in Hong Kong? You know, they're supposed to get 50 years, we're 25 years in, and so many freedoms are already gone. Is it about who's in power? Is it about Xi Jinping? Or was this going to happen no matter what?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complicated and interesting question. So Maggie Thatcher went to Beijing in September 1982, the first sitting British Prime Minister to do so. She was fresh off the Falklands victory. She really went in, and I think all of you who know Thatcher can imagine she went in thinking, I'm not giving this place back to these communists. And she came up with a formula that would allow formal sovereignty to go back to China, but for administration, British and colonial administration, to continue for another 50 years. And a lot of the Hong Kong business community, well-known names even today, were completely on Thatcher's side. But when she went to see Deng Xiaoping, he literally spat into a spittoon when she suggested that. I mean, he was having none of it. Although the Chinese economy was much weaker then, this idea of the unequal treaties, that Hong Kong, above all, Hong Kong had been wrested from China in a really horrific war that was giving the British the right to sell opium into China. I mean, that just stuck in the Chinese craw, and they really, really wanted Hong Kong back. And Deng told her, and it was true, look, we can march in and take this place tomorrow. They wouldn't have even had to march in. They just cut off the water. I mean, Hong Kong is dependent on China for food and water. Resupplying Hong Kong, doing something like the Berlin airlift that kept West Berlin vibrant and viable in the early 1950s, just a non-starter. So China was always ready to take Hong Kong, and I think Deng meant what he said. I do think, though, that the Chinese leadership has always misread the people of Hong Kong, and I would say that's in large part because they get a lot of their information from fellow travelers, communists and sympathizers in Hong Kong, and they get way too much information from the Hong Kong business community. And having been there for 28 years and knowing many people in the Hong Kong business community intimately, I think they're just really out of touch with the aspirations of the people in Hong Kong. And so I think China was also misled. It really thought that Hong Kong people were going to welcome the PLA troops marching in there with open arms. And Hong Kong people, either they or their parents, had almost all fled this very government in China. They'd fled the Chinese Communist Party. The last thing they wanted was CCP rule. So, I think there was a lot of wishful thinking on both sides, including on the Chinese side. I think the reason that China promised universal suffrage for the city council, the legislative council, 10 years after the handover, is it really thought that it would win the hearts and minds of the Hong Kong people. And nothing could have been farther from the truth. In every single territory-wide election, from the first one in 1991, yes, it was shockingly late, but 1991 for LegCo, until the last elections in 2019 for the district council, the pro-democracy candidates got more or less, usually a little bit less, but more or less 6 out of 10 of every vote. You know, it's just an incredible majority despite bullying and threats by the Chinese who were trying to coerce people into voting for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, just to finish on the economy, at the time of the handover in 1997, the Hong Kong economy was equivalent in size to about 18% of the Chinese economy. Last time I looked, it was 3%, and it's probably shrinking. So, yeah, Hong Kong didn't matter as much. Could China have gone in another way? Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's possible. A lot of people thought that it could. Before Xi Jinping, I thought that it was going more towards a kind of early 1980s Soviet kind of collective leadership, just lots of corruption. It was kind of tough. They weren't going to really open up on democracy, but they weren't going to have the kind of brutal surveillance state that we've seen now. In retrospect, it seems like we were all very naive, but I think engagement was worth trying. I was a big supporter of China getting into the WTO. In fact, wrote an earlier book on it with a WTO Director General. I think the rest of the world just let China have too much of a pass when it came to the WTO and didn't force them to live up to their obligations under that treaty.
There are microphones out there in the audience, but maybe just one question for you, and then open it up to all of you out there. Like I mentioned, he's a fascinating, incredible individual with, I think, a spirit and just a heart and a sense of principles and decency that's hard to imagine. In some ways, what's even harder to imagine is, unlike most people, you think about people out there protesting and fighting back against their government, who's doing it as a teenager, or their 20s, or maybe their 30s. This is someone who's done most of the heaviest lifting in his 60s and 70s. 79 straight days taking part in protests, a few years ago. 77, I believe, years old now. How in the world does he do it? Where does he find the strength? Is it from his faith, from his principles? How does he persevere? And as far as you know now, how is he physically doing, and mentally, how is he doing?
Yeah, he's an extraordinary guy, as I hope has become clear. I took the title because I asked him in 2019 when I was working on an earlier book, like, Jimmy, why do you do this? He goes, I don't know. It's who I am. I'm a troublemaker. And he is just a guy who just wants to stir things up, but not for the sake of stirring up, because he genuinely wants the world to be a better place. And he so much imbibed what he usually would call Western values. Sometimes he calls them universal values that he believes were bequeathed on Hong Kong, on the Hong Kong people, by the British colonial period, during the British colonial period. First, rule of law. Even for a press guy, yes, he talks about freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but he always singles out rule of law. And he felt that he needed to fight for that. Hong Kong was promised this. This is what the Hong Kong people wanted. He saw himself, I think, in media as kind of channeling the aspirations and the voice of Hong Kong people. And this is, I think, one of the things that, one of 3 factors I would single out that make him so frightening to the old men, and they are old men in Zhongnan High, the leadership compound in Beijing. First of all, he had money. You couldn't buy him off. You attack Giordano, he says, I don't care, I'll start another business. I mean, he had this entrepreneurial self-confidence that I've talked about. So he had resources. He had a media outlet, which again is like a big megaphone. And I think anybody who knows even the most rudimentary facts about the Chinese Communist Party can appreciate how concerned the party is with the media. It's what they see, propaganda in the media is the same thing. The media should serve their interests. And the third thing, he has principles, he has values, he's a devout Catholic, but even before he was Catholic, he believed he would do what he thought was right. And somehow this combination has fused to make him, I would argue, a singular figure in modern Chinese history. I don't think, again, I'd love it if one of you in the audience can suggest to other people I should think about who kind of parallel Jimmy, but I can't think of anybody since 1949. Although there have been many, many brave people. Liu Xiaobo got a Nobel Peace Prize, died in prison, but nobody's had this combination of money, media megaphone, and principles in the form that Jimmy bundles it together. I was lucky enough to see a number of letters, some of which I quote from very selectively in the book, that were written the first couple of years in prison. And I think mentally and spiritually, he's holding up extremely well. And it's said by people close to him that he's freer than he's ever been. And I was lucky enough to be the moderator at during a live stream event. Jimmy and I had about 15 or 20 of them in the 6 months before he was in prison. It was with Nathan Sharansky, who many of you might know spent 9 years in a Soviet gulag and is just an incredible person, and was, I think, a real model that Jimmy wanted to emulate. And so this conversation, I was kind of nominally the moderator, was really Jimmy asking, how can I be the best political prisoner possible? And Sharansky, I think Jimmy's tried to model Sharansky's answer, and he said, look, when I was in prison, I knew it was up to my KGB captors as to when I would be free, physically free. But I could live as a free man in prison. And I can, I still have my free will, I can still decide, I can think. And that's what Jimmy's tried to do. And by all accounts, he's succeeding remarkably well. However, the body does intervene, and he's 77 years old, had diabetes, I think, as I've mentioned before, diabetes before he went to prison. He'd suffered hearing loss when he worked in the factory as a teenager. He'd actually lost a tip of a finger. Since being in prison, he's had COVID, despite being in solitary confinement, so I don't quite get that. He had a cataract operation that seems to have not been particularly successful. He seems to have trouble hearing and seeing, some of the proceedings in court. His son Sebastian, who I've mentioned before, born in 1994, so 30 years old now, was just in Geneva. I think he is now today. I was just there's a Reuters piece that just came out, and he's expressing increasing concern about his father's health. To me, that signals things may be worse than we realize, because Jimmy is somebody who never likes to complain, and he wouldn't want people to complain about him. So I think Teresa or the family, and they're seeing him, when he's in court and during visits, I think they must really be concerned about his physical health. And so he's a UK citizen. I think it's time he's willing, anxious even, I guess, or definitely ready to leave Hong Kong when he's let out of jail. So I think Sebastian and the family's message is, bring our dad home, let him go to the UK, let him spend his last years with his family.
And if there are questions out there, I guess maybe if y'all can just kind of let me know. And just a quick follow-up to it, because as you mentioned, you're a representative of an organization, the president of an organization for human rights of all of Hong Kong. 1,900 people arrested and convicted, almost 1,000 still in prison. This was your home for almost 30 years. You didn't have any intentions of leaving. Can you go back to Hong Kong, or would it be a one-way trip? What's your status?
Yeah, well, it's hard to test that theory, because I did have permanent residence. My understanding is I've got the right to land. I couldn't work there now because I've been out for more than 3 years. But I don't know, but if I make a calculation and I'm wrong, and it's kind of like a Roach Motel, you can check in and you can't check out, that's not very good. I don't know. I mean, in all seriousness, my Chinese colleagues are the ones that really bear the brunt of it. People aren't beating me up, they aren't following me. This happens especially in the UK to all of our Chinese activist colleagues. US has been much better about that, but it seems that people like me have a kind of a certain, I don't know if we're just too troublesome or what, but anyway, I'm not going to test it anytime soon. I'd love to go back to Hong Kong. I know Marty and Kathy are going to be back there soon for the Asia Society, and look forward to hearing reports from the front when you return. It's still in many ways a remarkable city, but it's not free the way it was, and that's sad.
Yes, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. I've visited Hong Kong many times. The question I have is, what is, in your opinion, the future of Hong Kong? All these demonstrations, are they having an effect? Is all the decisions made locally by the administration there, or is it basically dictated by what they say in Beijing? Are there elections? Are there actual candidates that are running that would oppose this? Or I'm just saying, is the futility of the demonstrations, or is there really a purpose in trying to change what is happening in Hong Kong?
Well, there are no more demonstrations in Hong Kong. There are no elections that are worth being called elections. That people have to be so-called patriotic candidates, which means pro-Chinese Communist Party. I think at this point, we're trying to keep things from getting worse, and we're trying to get the message across to Chinese authorities that the crackdown in Hong Kong is now becoming counterproductive. To your question about who's making the decisions, it probably was people in Hong Kong who made the decision to prosecute Jimmy Lai and some others in the way that they did. I think that their superiors in Beijing may now realize that this was both a tactical and a strategic mistake. And I think our work, and maybe I can just mention a little bit about what we do at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. We have offices in Washington and in London, and engage a lot with Parliament and with Congress and with the respective governments in the U.S., State Department, Treasury Department, National Security Council. That's one kind of, I think of it as like a three-legged stool. That's probably the most important stool of our work. We do a lot of media work and just outreach, public speaking, events like this. Also important, get an enormous amount of media coverage. And the third is select research reports, which are designed to shed a light on the true situation in Hong Kong. The most recent one we did last summer was on Hong Kong's increasingly important role as a center for sanctions evasion. So Hong Kong is probably the most important place in the world where dual-use technologies are being smuggled through in service of the Russian war effort in Ukraine. Hong Kong has flipped from being an open port that was basically allied with democracies to one that increasingly serves autocracies. So the amount of smuggling for North Korea, sanctions evasion, Russia, Myanmar, and Iran is extraordinary in Hong Kong. And so we are, through that, we're trying to show the rest of the world that, Hong Kong isn't just a nice, cuddly place to do business of the sort that it was when you visited. So let's be realistic. Democracy is not coming back to Hong Kong anytime soon. Real change won't come to Hong Kong until there's real change in China. And a lot of people have grown very old waiting for that to happen. So I don't think we're not working for the end of the Chinese Communist Party. I think most of us would be delighted to see it happen because that's really Hong Kong's only hope. Until then, we're trying to ameliorate the situation. So love to see the bounties being taken off these 19 people. I'd love to see the 1,000 political prisoners let out and charges dropped against other people. And I think that the Trump administration in particular has shown a real concern and willingness, especially with Jimmy Lai's case. President Trump himself during the campaign said that it would be very easy to get Jimmy Lai out, 100% guaranteed. I do think that we have people in the administration who are very strongly disposed toward the human rights community in Hong Kong and beyond in China. And I think that we'll see some momentum on that. Obviously, it's early days for the administration, and events in Ukraine in particular are probably likely to tie up the foreign policy team for a while. The good news, if we can call it that, is that the number of new arrests of new political prisoners has dwindled to almost nothing. We thought that January was the first month since the national security law came into place in mid-2020 that we had not had any new political prisoners. In fact, there seemed to have been 2 or 3 that we found out about belatedly. And just keep a spotlight on Hong Kong. We keep the pressure up on Hong Kong officials. There are sanctions on a number of officials, which they absolutely hate. And so I think, there's going to have to be some kind of grand political bargain that will have to be at levels way, way, way above where I work. And I'm specifically thinking of President Trump, General Secretary Xi Jinping, perhaps Prime Minister Keir Starmer, given the fact that Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. He's expressed concern publicly in the presence of Xi Jinping about Jimmy's continuing imprisonment. But yeah, I'd be kind of crazy to get up here and say that I think there's a possibility of a short-term return to democracy and freedom in Hong Kong.
Mark, two questions. First, is there a U.S. equivalent to the Apple Daily, the newspaper that Jimmy promoted and wrote for so many years? Is there a U.S. equivalent? Is it the New York Daily News, the Post, or anything of that sort?
That's a great question. One of Jimmy's brilliances was he had a very wide-ranging, syncretic kind of mind, and he, first with Next magazine, tried to put together just everything. So there was horse racing, there were columns by Nobel Prize-winning economists, there were a lot of paparazzi stuff, there were investigations. So it's a kind of a mash of maybe New York Post, Wall Street Journal, and I don't know, New York Times.
Yeah, thank you. So there are technically speaking, there are 22 years until the end of the agreement, the 50-year agreement. As you look forward, you're a historian, but as you look forward, does that even matter? Are we already at 2047, or is there something dramatic going to happen on 2047? At the end of June of 2047 that will somehow change Hong Kong irrevocably back to communist model.
I mean, it's interesting because I think in most of what we would regard as the most important things in terms of freedoms, common law, trial by jury, I mean, all this stuff has been thrown out the window. All these are guaranteed in the basic law. Jimmy doesn't have trial by jury. His trial by hand-picked judges who are picked from a secret list. He's not able to get his own counsel. They rewrote the rules to deny that. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that are gone. What would be interesting, and your former banker would be, as you know, Hong Kong has its own currency. It's got its own tax regime. I mean, does all that stay in place? I kind of doubt it. Do they wait until June 30th, 2047 so they can say, look, we did it. You had your 50 years, and now we're going to get away with the Hong Kong dollar? Maybe, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who wonder how long the Hong Kong dollar and its peg to the US dollar is really going to last in a Chinese context. But I think some of those things, they've got separate tax, separate currency, everything that maybe that'll last. But I think as far as freedoms are concerned, it's already done, it's finished.
Are you guys okay? We just do kind of one or two more? We're almost over. But because I know there's one question or two in the front, right? Do you have the microphone? Great.
Hello, my name is Madeline Liu. I have two questions. One, as a former editor of the South China Morning Post, how has the People's Republic of China's censorship policies affected Hong Kong journalism?
That's the first question, I guess. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very interesting. The South China Morning Post barely covers Jimmy Lai's trial. It's probably the most important political trial in the world right now. It's open court. And yet you'd hardly know that reading the South China Morning Post. Other newspapers have been shut down. So Apple Daily's obviously been shut. Stand News, a whole slew of other quite independent papers have been shut, and other ones have been coerced and intimidated into timidity. So we can't if we come out with a big report, like the one that I mentioned on sanctions evasion, that won't be covered by the Hong Kong press until the government responds to it. So, I mean, it's been a dramatic narrowing of what's permitted in Hong Kong. Even what I would regard as really mild criticism is considered and labeled by the government as so-called soft resistance, which could lead to charges on sedition or even national security law charges. So it's had a dramatic effect. And if we look at Hong Kong's press freedom rankings in 2003, when Reporters Without Borders started press rankings, Hong Kong was the 18th freest press in the world. More recently, it's been around 160 or so, one of the worst in the world.
My second question is, where is China, as I'm the president of Model United Nations at my high school, and I'm just wondering, where is China going forward in the United Nations, considering their veto power in the General Assembly?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, China likes to use the United Nations, and they obviously have veto power. I think they like the idea of a rules-based order, as I said, when it benefits them. I think they've been very cynical in their use of, for example, the Human Rights Commission and other UN bodies to shut down discussion of genuine issues. Obviously, I'm particularly focused on human rights issues, but I believe there are other ones as well. So discussions of things like mistreatment of Uyghurs, the ethnic minorities, I guess the Muslim people in Western China, discussions of Hong Kong. So it's unfortunate that China feels the need to, I think, usurp the powers of the United Nations and its constituent bodies.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I think I'm volunteering Mark to stay afterwards. If anyone want to get his excellent book, he will sign them afterwards. And I will say we have it for a nice nonprofit price of $20, which is like, I don't know, 40-50% off of the cover price. We're a nonprofit for a reason. And again, I just want to thank Marty Goosen, Matt Fuller, everyone at Asia Society. It's always so wonderful, so great to be with you all again. Such a gorgeous facility and a great organization to partner with and work with. And I think all will kind of keep our best hopes and thoughts for Jimmy Lai and kind of keep them updated as we go. And maybe just would let people know to please check out Mark's organization, the work that you all do. And I just more importantly just want to say, Mark, thank you very much for coming here this evening, and thank you very much for the work that you're continuing to do.
Well, thank you so much.